There are a lot of misconceptions about the 20 great rings of power. A reason for that might be that the information is spread across multiple of Tolkien's books and writings. Even inside Lord of the Rings, they are spread across several chapters. In addition, the Peter Jackson films, some games and other works implied certain ideas that are in conflict with what Tolkien actually wrote. The combination of both might even generate some confusion among book fans. Today we look into some of those misconceptions and see what Tolkien actually wrote, and of course, as always, I try to give you the exact quotes, and I will mainly focus on what is in Lord of the Rings with a bit of the Silmarillion and maybe unfinished tales mixed in. We also look into one of Tolkien's letters, which you also find in the Silmarillion. That is letter 131. My name is Chris, aka ThePhilosophersGames, and as always a few hints. I try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it. Shoutouts to the artists who allowed me to use their fantastic artworks like Kimberly 80, Ted Naismith, Jenny Dolphin, Sara Morello, and many more. Also spoiler warning, I guess. The first small misconception is the amount of great rings of power. A question that comes up at times is, does the One Ring count as a great ring of power? Of course, we know from the ring verse that there are 3 plus 7 plus 9, so 19 rings, and the One Ring. Gandalf, who wears Narya, the Ring of Fire, gives us, you could say, a definition in the chapter The Shadow of the Past when he talks to Frodo, quote, "A mortal Frodo who keeps one of the great rings does not die, but he does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues until at last every minute is a weariness. And if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes in the end invisible permanently and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings." This also applies to the One Ring, however not completely to the 3 Elven Rings of Power, which we will talk about in a moment. However, this detail does not matter here because this rough definition definitely fits to what the One Ring does. But there is even a more clear statement from the Council of Elrond where the participants discuss if it's really the One Ring, and Gandalf says about Gollum, "The power of the ring had lengthened his, Gollum's, years far beyond their span, but that power only the great rings wield." Note that great rings is also written capitalized. In the Silmarillion we also find a quite explicit statement. "And there into the fire where it was wrought he cast the great ring of power, and so at last it was unmade and its evil consumed." So, in my opinion, it's pretty clear that the One Ring is counted towards the great rings of power. Now one could ask, if there are great rings of power, are there also lesser rings of power? Yes. I guess before the Elven Smiths in Eregion Anda Celebrimbor made the 19 great rings of power, they also made an unspecified amount of lesser rings with the knowledge Sauron taught them. I assume this helped them to grow their craft to perfection. Quote, "In Eregion, long ago, many elven rings were made, magic rings as you call them, and they were, of course, of various kinds, some more potent and some less. The lesser rings were only essays in the craft before it was full grown, and to the elven smiths they were but trifles, yet still to my mind dangerous for mortals. But the great rings, the rings of power, they were perilous." In my opinion, this is a very important detail because Gandalf must have thought that Bilbo and Frodo later had one of these lesser rings, else he should have concluded much faster that they had indeed found the One Ring. Maybe Gandalf was also missing some key information needed for this conclusion. For example, that the lesser rings did not prolong life. Quote, "He knows that it is a great ring, for it gave long life." Also, where some of the 7 Dwarven rings were was for sure hard to figure out, though he knew that Sauron had at least one of the 7 when he found Thorin's father Throin II, I use the Old Norse pronunciation here, in Dol Guldur about 19 years before the events of The Hobbit. On top of that, the 19 rings of power all had their quote proper gem, which is different for the lesser rings and of course the One Ring. The 9, the 7 and the 3, he said, had each their proper gem, not so the one. It was round and unadorned, as it were one of the lesser rings. I also already answered another misconception: who made the great rings of power? The One Ring was made by Sauron alone, and the rest was made by the elves, so technically all 19 rings of power are elven rings. And that is another common misconception. As said, originally all 19 were elven rings, then Sauron conquered Eregion in the Second Age and stole 16 of them, while the 3 were hidden in time. Then, a few centuries later in the Second Age, when the mortals probably forgot what happened, he gifted 9 to men and 7, or maybe only 6, to the dwarves. And only here they became known as the 9 rings of men and the 7 of the dwarves. In Appendix B of the Lord of the Rings, we can read: the elven smiths, instructed by Sauron, reach the height of their skill. They begin the forging of the rings of power. The 3 rings are completed in Eregion. Sauron forges one ring in Orodruin. He completes the Barad-dûr. Celebrimbor perceives the designs of Sauron. So Sauron taught the elves the technique or design and knowledge to create rings of power. They then used that to create their first versions of the rings, the lesser rings, to perfect their skill, and then they forged the 16 rings of power, with Sauron observing the process and even touching the rings. But Sauron guided their labors, and he was aware of all they did. And further, therefore the 3 remained unsullied, for they were forged by Celebrimbor alone, and the hand of Sauron had never touched them, yet they also were subject to the One. This line implies that this was different for the other rings of power and points out that only the 3 elven rings remained unsullied, else Tolkien could have left out that sentence. But in my opinion, he wanted to highlight the contrast here. Also, Sauron was present when the 16 rings were created, but not when the 3 were made. As said, Sauron left Ostinethil, the capital city of Eregion, to create the One Ring in secret in Mordor in the fires of Mount Doom, and Celebrimbor in secret as well created his magnum opus, the 3 elven rings of power, with some small design changes, and as we just learned, Sauron did not touch them, which is very important because in contrast to the 16 great rings, they do actually some good. In this context, here touching or pressing the subscribe button does some good, but jokes aside. So what do the rings actually do? Quite a few things. I spoke of a difference between the 16 great rings and the 3. One big difference is that the 3 do not turn the wearer invisible. Tolkien explains this in letter 131, which is also published in the Silmarillion. We can read: the elves of Eregion made 3 supremely beautiful and powerful rings, almost solely of their own imagination, and directed to the preservation of beauty. They did not confer invisibility. The 16 rings, in contrast, turn you invisible, quote, and finally, they, the 16 rings of power, had other powers more directly derived from Sauron, such as rendering invisible the material body and making things of the invisible world visible. Think of the Nazgûl, which were invisible and turned into wraiths, undead slaves to Sauron's will. We can read: and if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades, and becomes in the end invisible permanently, and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. To explain this a bit further, Tolkien's world has visible physical aspect and an invisible one, often called the unseen. The 16 rings, including the One Ring, can transfer your physical appearance into the unseen and make you, as such, invisible for mortal eyes. Some beings can see the unseen nonetheless, though. Check out my video called Who Can See the Unseen? Those transferred to the unseen can also see it. Tolkien writes that this ability is more directly derived from Sauron. Why is that? It comes down to interpretation here. Mine would be related to what Tolkien wrote in the following text about the 9 men who became the Nazgul that we find in the Silmarillion. They, the 9 men, could walk if they would unseen by all eyes in this world beneath the sun, and they could see things in worlds invisible to mortal men, but too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron. Sauron is one of the Maiar, a powerful spirit being of lower rank comparable to angels, though in Sauron's case an evil one. Of course, the Maiar took physical forms when they came to Arda. As spirit being, he has power over the unseen as well as over the seen, the physical world, probably far more than elves and especially men, who usually can't even see it. The line, "but too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron," is in my opinion very important in this context, because that is potentially why the second Dark Lord saw it as an important ability to add to the rings. Due to this, he can influence those who wear the rings even better, I guess. Sauron is also called the Necromancer, and as such, he can send these phantoms of the unseen to those who use the rings. What happens then, we find in the next sentence of the quoted passage. "And one by one, sooner or later, according to the 9 men's native strengths and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore, and under the domination of the one which was Sauron's. And they became forever invisible, save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows." In contrast, the purpose of the 3 is slightly different, or more focused on preservation, I should say. They lack this ability to make people invisible, but if that makes its wearer harder to control is impossible to say. They at least have done more good. It is, however, still possible to get control over those who wear the 3 as well. Quote, "If he recovers it, then he will command them all again, wherever they be, even the 3. The One Ring, as these quotes further imply, is the Master Ring and allows domination of those who wear a ring of power. For example, Galadriel, who wears Nenya, the Ring of Water, says to Frodo in this context, "For if you fail, then we are laid bare to the enemy." And Frodo later asks, "I, Frodo, am permitted to wear the One Ring. Why cannot I see all the others and know the thoughts of those that wear them?" Which implies what is possible with the One Ring. The Silmarillion describes this more detailed. And while he, Sauron, wore the One Ring, he could perceive all the things that were done by the means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore them. Further, Elrond, who wears Vilya, the Ring of Air, says something similar during his council. But all that has been wrought by those who wield the 3 will turn to their undoing, and their minds and hearts will become revealed to Sauron if he regains the One. And in letter 131, Tolkien himself phrases it quite drastically. But secretly, in the subterranean fire in his own Black Land, Sauron made one ring, the ruling ring, that contained the powers of all the others and controlled them, so that its wearer could see the thoughts of all those that used the lesser rings, could govern all that they did, and in the end could utterly enslave them. The One Ring also enhanced the power of its possessor. Quote, "Did not Gandalf tell you that the rings give power according to the measure of each possessor? This implies that this is true for the other rings as well, and Tolkien also mentions this in letter 131. But also they, the Rings of Power, enhanced the natural powers of a possessor, thus approaching magic, a motive easily corrupted into evil, a lust for domination. Also, some people might think, because hobbits were good at hiding, as we learn in Concerning Hobbits, that the One Ring enhanced this ability, and Gollum, Bilbo and Frodo could as a result become invisible, but as we just learned, that was not the case. Even Isildur turned invisible, and he was not a hobbit. The Rings of Power, except the three, could simply move its bearer to the unseen. But the main purpose of the 19 Rings of Power is the following. The chief power of all the rings alike was the prevention or slowing of decay, for example, change viewed as a regrettable thing, the preservation of what is desired or loved, or its semblance. This is more or less an elvish motive. To explain what is meant by decay a bit further, the first Dark Lord Morgoth, once the master of Sauron, was the most powerful of the Valar, the angels of highest rank, the powers of Arda. He, though, was the dissonance of the harmony of the world, and to bring this dissonance over the world, he tried to destroy or corrupt the works of the other Valar, and of Eru, that is God. He even infused big parts of the world itself with his evil power and damaged it. In Tolkien's philosophical and metaphysical essays about his world, we find the term Arda Mard. Arda is the name of the world. Basically, what Sauron did with just a ring, the One Ring, Morgoth did with parts of the world itself. To quote Tolkien here, the whole of Middle-earth was Morgoth's ring. This dissonance became the nature of Middle-earth and other places, I guess, and clashes with the harmonic, pure and immortal nature of the elves, and is the source of what is in the letter called decay. It leads to the fading of the elves if they stay too long in, for example, Middle-earth, many thousand years. I usually describe it with Middle-earth being a place of change, while the immortal elves are beings that don't change much. Remember the line, change viewed as a regrettable thing. The power of Morgoth is far less existent in, for example, the oceans and on the west continent Aman, due to the presence of the forces of good there, the Valar and Maiar, which is why the elves sail there at some point. The idea behind those rings of power was now to slow down this decay for the realms of those who had a ring of power, and this ability was even stronger in the Three Elven Rings of Power. Elrond says about them, but they, the three, were not made as weapons of war or conquest. That is not their power. Those who made them did not desire strength or domination or hoarded wealth, but understanding, making and healing, to preserve all things unstained. So healing the world around them from change and decay is the intention of those three rings. About some rings of the three, we know some more details. For example, about Gandalf's ring, Narya, the Ring of Fire, which once belonged to Círdan, we know, quote, "For this is a ring of fire, and with it you may rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill." Gandalf receiving Narya was interestingly a very late addition of Tolkien to the book. About Vilya we do not know much, but it was the mightiest of the three. It seems there was a short time where Tolkien thought about Nenya being the most powerful of the three. About Nenya, the Ring of Galadriel, we find quite a bit of interesting information in Tolkien's writings, and maybe some of it can be applied to the others as well. For example, there is one downside. It was at that time that she received Nenya, the white ring from Celebrimbor, and by its power the realm of Lorinand was strengthened and made beautiful, but its power upon her was great also and unforeseen, for it increased her latent desire for the sea and for return into the west, so that later her joy in Middle-earth was diminished. What is meant by preserving and slowing the decay is, in my opinion, also well described in the Lothlorien chapters of Lord of the Rings. Frodo felt that he was in a timeless land that did not fade or change or fall into forgetfulness. and no blemish or sickness or deformity could be seen in anything that grew upon the earth. On the land of Lorien there was no stain. In the Silmarillion it's phrased quite well too. For those who had them in their keeping could ward off the decays of time and postpone the weariness of the world. The power to preserve is however bound to the One Ring. If it's destroyed, the rings might lose their power as well. Yet if you, Frodo, succeed, then our power is diminished and Lothlorien will fade, and the tides of time will sweep it away. Elrond assumes this as well. Some hope that the three rings which Sauron has never touched would then become free, and their rulers might heal the hurts of the world that he has wrought. But maybe when the One Ring has gone, the three will fail, and many fair things will fade and be forgotten. That is my belief. Another detail about the three we find in this quote from Gandalf. He knows that it is not one of the three, for they have never been lost, and they endure no evil. As said earlier, Sauron did not touch the three rings. The touch of Sauron would have given them a baleful or evil tendency, but he did not, and so the keepers of those three rings can do a lot of good with it. And we can even read, they endure no evil. For example, they would most likely not have corrupted Smeagol or Smeagol into Gollum. I guess they would also not have made the dwarves more greedy or turned the Nine into Nazgul. At least as long as Sauron would not have the One Ring. You might ask, what did the elves do when Sauron had the One Ring? They simply did not use them. Initially, when the One Ring was created, the elves took the rings from their fingers, quote from the Silmarillion. As soon as Sauron set the One Ring upon his finger, they were aware of him, and they knew him, and perceived that he would be master of them, and all that they wrought. Then in anger and fear they took off their rings. In Lord of the Rings we find this description as well. For in the day that Sauron first put on the one, Celebrimbor, maker of the three, was aware of him, and from afar he heard him speak these words, and so his evil purpose was revealed. In this context Elrond also explains, for in the days of Isildur the ruling ring passed out of all knowledge, and the three were released from its dominion. The Silmarillion also hints at this, but Sauron could not discover them, for they were given into the hands of the wise, who concealed them and never again used them openly, while Sauron kept the ruling ring. So, after Sauron lost the One Ring in the War of the Last Alliance, the elves could use their rings again, without risking to be mastered by Sauron. They still hid them though, and for example, Sam was not able to see Nenya on Galadriel's hand, while Frodo could see it due to him wearing the One Ring and using it at times. Elrond explains further, but all that has been wrought by those who wield the three will turn to their undoing, and their minds and hearts will become revealed to Sauron if he regains the one. It would be better if the three had never been. That is his purpose. Gandalf also confirms this. If he recovers it, then he will command them all again, wherever they be, even the three, and all that has been wrought with them will be laid bare, and he will be stronger than ever. Even though losing the One Ring made it possible to use the three again and do a lot of good with it, it still meant that Sauron existed and could return. Quote, Sauron was diminished but not destroyed. His ring was lost but not unmade. The Dark Tower was broken, but its foundations were not removed, for they were made with the power of the ring, and while it remains, they will endure. Tolkien also writes in an essay called The Istari in Unfinished Tales, Galadriel, the greatest of the Eldar surviving in Middle-earth, was potent mainly in wisdom and goodness. As a director or counselor in the struggle, unconquerable in resistance, especially in mind and spirit, but incapable of punitive action. Galadriel is here an example. The elves after the War of the Last Alliance diminished or decayed very slowly in a way that they had not the power anymore to stop Sauron on a larger scale. I guess this is a further factor why it's the last alliance of elves and men. Elrond also argues into this direction. Never again shall there be any such league of elves and men, for men multiply and the firstborn decrease, and the two kindreds are estranged. And ever since that day the race of Numenor has decayed and the span of the years lessened. But let us move on. In context of the Battle of the Last Alliance, there is maybe also an unusual question. Did the One Ring shrink in size to fit its new bearer, or did Peter Jackson and his team made this up? Yes, Tolkien also described this briefly in his book. Isildur himself noted, "Yet even as I write, it is cool, and it seemeth to shrink, though it loseth neither its beauty nor its shape." And also Gandalf quotes Bilbo with, "It did not seem always of the same size or weight. It shrank or expanded in an odd way, and might suddenly slip off a finger when it had been tied." This seems to be related to another unusual detail, and much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that One Ring, we read in the Silmarillion, almost like the One Ring had a will of its own. And indeed, Sauron's will was in it. It was almost like a part of Sauron himself in the form of a ring. However, it was not like Sauron could sense it all the time. The films exaggerate this and the ability of the Nazgul quite a bit compared to the books. And in some details from the books, we also find very small inconsistencies in Tolkien's writings at times. There is also this unusual statement of Gandalf. "A ring of power looks after itself, Frodo. It may slip off treacherously, but its keeper never abandons it. At most, he plays with the idea of handing it on to someone else's care, and that only at an early stage, when it first begins to grip." This statement contradicts what we know in parts, but is very fitting to the One Ring, not so much to the other rings of power. Thorin's grandfather Thror gave his ring of power to his son Throin II. Gandalf got Narya from Círdan, Elrond got Vilya from Gil-galad. All of them had them for long times and surrendered them freely, so it's strange that Gandalf makes this general statement, and in my opinion he only means the One Ring. Why would one of the 19 rings of power escape its bearer when its secret purpose is to dominate the bearer through the One Ring? Very strange. However, I think this should cover quite detailed what the rings actually do and clear some misconceptions about them. There are more details for sure. Let me know what I missed in the comments. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like to see more detailed lore videos, maybe check out my channel. Last video we were looking quite detailed into all the versions Tolkien wrote of First Age Galadriel. In the video before, we looked into a time of hardship for the people of Rohan under Helm Hammerhand. If you liked this video, press a like button, write a comment and subscribe, including pressing the annoying bell. Would be much appreciated. Next will be more lore videos. New Who is Elrond part is planned. This video might be released on the German channel in German as well, and I assume on Saturday we have a watch party livestream for the third Hobbit film, The Battle of the Five Armies here. You find the previous watch parties and other lore Q&A livestreams as VOD under the live tab on my channel. There's also a watch party playlist somewhere. If you are into video games, check my gaming channel or Twitch stream as well. All is linked in the description. Also, shoutouts to all the artists that gave me permission to use their artworks and to all of you supporting me. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.